Excellent.
Pint of local ale.
Welcome, ladies and gents. Welcome one and all to this, the Salmon and Trout Conservation UK's third and final Untangled talk, I should say, of the season, really, because we're hoping to resume this autumn, all being well. If this is your first Untangled session, well, some of what will be said this evening will doubtless provoke strong feelings. I, for one, though, intend for these sessions to be conducted in the spirit of warm conviviality and, it's about a fly fisher you don't like. Now, a couple of months back, we had the pleasure of untangling Fergal Sharkey, whose focus in recent times on water quality has made him something of a hero, I would suggest, in these unusual times. And without his activism, I was wondering earlier this week, if we would have seen the revolting subject of sewage being dumped in our rivers by water companies on the BBC 6 o'clock news. Then last time out, we had, he untangled the natural historian and wildlife camera operator extraordinaire, Jack Perks. His USP, I guess, has been to make our humble and oft overlooked sort of indigenous freshwater fish look as sort of beautiful, as esoterically gorgeous as we all here this evening know them to be. And it was really interesting, I thought, to hear Jack describe how he was viewed with suspicion in some quarters because he's had to work with both those evil water companies, as Fergal would describe them, as well as the people on the forces of good. So as if getting into the river in his wetsuit in all weathers wasn't challenge enough. I thought it was really interesting that Jack described how he had to pick a very careful and considered approach when dealing with us humans as well. Now, I mention this because tonight's guest has picked yet another path still, or river really, to be specific, in order to share his tale, although it's not so much Adam Weymouth's story as that of the Chinook salmon. After reading his book, The Kings of the Yukon, you realise that the story, the subject is much, much bigger than even the Chinook, arguably the most magnificent of fish. Born in a chalk stream heaven, I found out, in Salisbury, Adam became an environmental activist up at university in Scotland, continued through the noughties rather, working with groups like Plain Stupid. He had the misfortune of being watched by the notorious undercover police officer Mark Kennedy as a result of this frankly scandalous abuse of female subjects. We have now ongoing reviews of undercover policing methods. That, I suspect, is a story for another day. He settled into life on a narrowboat on the River Lee, and it was there that he stumbled on a story that brings him here this evening, the plight of the Chinook salmon. But it wasn't that took you to Alaska in the first place, was it, back in 2013? Or was it, Adam?
No, I went to Alaska originally just to research stories about climate change and oil. I'd gone specifically to look into a story about Shell. Shell had been starting to explore for oil off the north coast of Alaska as the ice was starting to recede. That was opening up these places to explore for oil. But by the time I got there, they'd pulled out, and it was sort of a kind of series of mishaps and calamities that meant they weren't able to do it. And so I found myself with 3 months funded to just explore Alaska and look for these stories of climate change and oil. And it took me all over. There's absolutely no shortage of ways into these subjects. But the story that really grabbed me, that became the book, I'd heard about a chap called Mike Williams, he was chief then of the Yupik Nation, which are the people that live along the west coast of Alaska. And I'd heard about Mike because he'd been very outspoken about these climatic changes that as people were going through, the villages that were falling away into the sea as the permafrost beneath them was melting, things like this. He'd gone all around the world talking about it. And he invited me out to meet him on the west coast. And to get to his tiny little village, you had to go through this hub town of Bethel. There's about 10,000 people live there in this vast delta. And he said, while you're passing through town, you might as well check out this trial of these 23 Yupik fishermen that's happening at the time, which was going on in court. So I went into court for one day. I ended up staying for a week and reported on this case. And the case was these 23 Yupik fishermen had gone out to catch Chinook salmon, king salmon as they call it, defying a ban that the Alaska Department of Fish and Game had put in on the catching of the salmon. But getting caught hadn't been an accident. They'd press released their intentions before setting out. There was something in the kind of environmental activist that appealed to me there. and they were defending their right to go and catch these salmon. The Alaska Department of Fish and Game was saying numbers of these salmon have got so low that we need to preserve them for future generations. And they were saying that catching these salmon is part of our cultural tradition, almost our spiritual heritage. And they were defending themselves on the First Amendment, the right to practice their religion. And it just seemed to me that these two very different worlds were hitting up against each other.
Did you have a view at that point? You are learning about the collapse of salmon stocks. You are hearing the plight of the First Peoples, and you're hearing the efforts of the authorities to try and rectify the situation. Did you have a view then about who was right, who was wrong, the goodies, the baddies?
I think perhaps at the start, my money was probably on the underdog, was probably on these 23 Yupik fishermen that had gone out, and there was something quite poetic in their defense of what they were doing. But I came back to England and I wrote a story about it, and I followed the story. So the Yupik were on this small river called the Kuskokwim. It's called the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta. So the Kuskokwim is a little offshoot of the Yukon, a little bit further down. And then the next 2 years, on the entire length of the Yukon River, which is 2,000 miles, Canada and Alaska, there was a ban put in on the catching of the king salmon, which had never happened before. And so that was sport fishing, it was commercial fishing, and it was the indigenous harvest as well. That was completely unprecedented, and it made me feel that there's a much bigger and much more complicated story here than I've understood.
So you decide to get a canoe. I love it. It's a brave and brilliant thing to do. So from your canal boat in East London, you decide to get a canoe and start and paddle down the Yukon, which is the longest salmon run on the planet. How many? I don't even know how many miles you went. How many miles did you cover?
It's 1,994. It's the distance from London to Athens, as a kind of as a perspective, and I never really canoed. I wrote the proposal. It was this fantastic idea in my head. I'd done these kind of long overland journeys before, but mostly walking. So I was really into the idea of taking my time and sort of finding the first time I was in Alaska, a lot of these places, these villages are very remote. There's hardly any road system apart from connecting the main cities in Alaska. So I'd be catching these bush planes into these little villages, and I'd turn up and people wouldn't really know what I was doing there. It was a very sort of frosty reception a lot of the time. And I wanted to find a different way of approaching people, of turning up in people's villages that kind of gave some sort of sense to me being there. So a canoe was a really sensible way to do it, you know, and it is in many ways the way. You know, in the winter it's frozen over and people go up and down it on snowmobiles, and in the summer people go up and down it in boats. Not canoes very much anymore. A canoe was sort of quite a kind of quaint and antiquated form of travel, and everyone else is sort of going around in motorboats like you would. It's sort of like, you know, going on a holiday and taking a horse and a cart down a motorway or something. But I wrote the proposal, and my publisher was sitting with me in the meeting, and she was like, "So this sounds great, and how much canoeing experience have you got then?" And I was able to tell her that, well, you know, I've spent about half a day in a canoe up till this point. So we did as much training as we could. We spent about a week going down the Wye, went down the Dart for a couple of days, but it's just an altogether different scale, the Yukon. There's places where it's, you know, 2-3 miles across. It's just an enormous river.
To further put your adventure or your ambition into perspective, there's right in the middle of the book, and I did laugh out loud. It said you're joined about halfway down or halfway through the book, at least, by your partner Uli, and she's from northern Sweden and of Sami ancestry. And you describe, I just read this, ever since I've known her, she's been unable to pass a body of water without fishing it or jumping in it, and invariably both. And you then describe how she killed a fish right in front of you. And you write, you have no idea whether it's a salmon or not, which I thought was just a fantastic note to have, that here you are, you're already halfway down the Yukon on a mission to, at the very least, flag up the plight of at the salmon, and you weren't even sure what they were. It just blew my mind.
Yeah, I suppose we've been hearing about them as these kind of sort of mythic creatures. The idea was that we would start right at the top of the Yukon. So we started at a place called McNeil Lake, which is the very furthest that the king salmon travel. The very furthest king salmon get 1,994 miles from the mouth of the Yukon, and that's where they spawn. So we decided to start there, so we'd be covering the length of the salmon run. So at the time that we put in our canoe, beginning of May, so just after all the ice had gone out in the Yukon, there's only about a 4-month window that you can paddle. That was about the time that the salmon, the adults that were returning home to spawn, were entering the mouth of the Yukon River. So the whole way that we were going down, we'd be getting information, and I was signed up to the kind of daily email briefing that we'd get sort of where the salmon had got to. So there was this sense that we were kind of approaching each other, and going through these villages. We were meeting people that were getting their nets ready, getting their fishing reels ready, all these things. But I'd still never seen a salmon outside of the supermarket.
I'm going to come back to the supermarket later, if we may. Were you aware, because it was a really interesting way in for me, but I've got a note here, the Sally Barnes story. This is the question, I suppose, is whether you were aware that our Atlantic salmon were having problems. I said only the other day on our previous Untangled talk that by and large, the last time I've been to Canada, which is about 15 years ago, the guides were, oh, it's full of fish, you should come here, there's loads of salmon, So I had no, if I'm absolutely honest, I had no real clue as to just how bad, precarious the Chinook's future is. Were you aware of the Atlantic salmon, and how did you get the Sally Barnes story?
I definitely wasn't aware of the Atlantic story, no. And very few people I know are, I think. You know, there's so much salmon in the supermarket, what can the problem be? And, you know, I knew about salmon runs in Alaska. You know, we've all seen the David Attenborough documentaries and the bears pulling out the salmon in this kind of huge abundance, you know, and there are certain species of salmon in Alaska that are still doing pretty well. But what I didn't realize is that Alaska's famous for its salmon because it's the only place that's left that's got these amazing abundance of salmon. The whole West Coast, the whole East Coast of North America, Japan, all of Europe, you know, all these places have lost these massive salmon runs, and we hardly hear about it anymore. Sally Barnes that you mentioned was, I've just done a piece which was kind of a sort of UK island coda to Kings of the Yukon, because having written the book and starting to be contacted by people in the UK, I realized that, you know, I'm writing about a culture that's starting to vanish as the salmon disappear. This is something that we lost hundreds of years ago, and there's just the very last people hanging on. So Sally Barnes is the very last smoker of wild salmon left in Ireland. And she gets about 200 fish a year from fishermen on the Blackwater, and it's, you know, it's a beautiful boutique product. She's won, I forget what the competition is now, but one of these very significant kind of food taste awards. Beautiful, beautiful fish, but she's the last, and she won't touch the farm stuff because she thinks it's, you know, a different species really. But this, yeah, what we see starting to disappear in Alaska has gone here. You know, these people are in their 80s, 90s, and they're on their way out.
I found it. I'll tell you about the Magna Carta. You mentioned the Magna Carta in the book, and how in 1215 we were in this country. We must have been aware of concern about fish stocks, because the order is that we have to dismantle the holding ponds. I think it is for the king salmon, or the weirs for the king salmon. You, as you're traveling down the river, you can geographically, obviously everything changes. There's also the sort of peoples change, and there's this sort of section of the river which it aligns with the gold rush. And perhaps you could tell us about the bit that I remember being really struck by was that this is the first time that the fish is given a monetary value. And within a couple of years of it getting a monetary value, we have, as far as I could glean, the sort of first big stock collapse.
Yeah, it's hard to appreciate really how rapidly the north of Canada and Alaska changed. You know, we're sort of aware that kind of from 1492 onwards, North America, was in a period of change, but not really until the gold rush in 1896, the Klondike Gold Rush, had hardly any. There was a few Russians in Alaska, but basically no one had seen a white man in the North until 1896, when 100,000 people from all over the world came to. But it was all focused on this place that I go through in the book, Dawson City, where the Klondike River comes into, all kind of drawn in by these promises of gold. And these very small sort of fishing camps really just boomed into these towns with dance halls and brothels and bowling alleys and local newspapers and everything in a couple of years. And these people needed to eat. And so one of the explosions was these canning factories. And yeah, that seems to be one of the things that set this demise in motion. And not just, you see pictures from the time of these kind of black and white photos of these men in, sort of cravats and waistcoats holding up these 120 pound Chinook salmon that are literally as big as them. I think the biggest Chinook ever caught was 146 pounds, I believe, which is the upper limit of a featherweight boxer. Just enormous beasts. And that size has rapidly declined, and that seems to happen with a lot of fish stocks. As fish stocks start to struggle, it's not just the numbers that go down, but it's the size as well. And as they started to pull out these huge fish, the genetic stock started to alter, and that's one of the things that's really hit them hard.
The canning industry, I still, you treat everybody fairly, but there are bad players out there, and I found it. I couldn't work out how I felt about them as I was getting through, because I knew what their contribution would be, and by the time you get further down the river, still on the huge commercial fishers. But I was just thinking, you went through the netters, the smokers, hunters, dam builders, and commercial fishing operations, and you gave them all a fair hearing. Did that leave you? So does that leave you with a sort of back against the wall when it comes to sort of identifying where the problem is? If that is, because it's more complicated than one single problem.
It really is. I mean, and the fact that salmon have this incredible life cycle, it's very hard to know. Yeah, there is no smoking gun. Is it a problem with the river? Is it a problem out in the ocean? Is it what's going on in Canada, or is it what's going on in Alaska? These fish are subject to different regulations because of different treaties and tribes and countries and international ocean. There's so much going on.
That's kind of what I glean as the overall picture. In part, it's the abundance, the previous abundance, that it was perceived as a never-ending bounty, and then in the back end of the story, it is the fact that the fish geographically crosses so much territory, both within freshwater, within land, and then also out to sea, that everybody gets an opportunity, as you say in the book, to wash their hands of it. You can say, the people say, it's got nothing to do with what we're doing inland. It's got nothing to do with deforestation, which I'm going to come back to later. It's got nothing to do with any of those. It's all happening because of the blob, this sort of superheated section of water out to sea, and there's nothing we can do about that. You can just see it's just the perfect storm for disaster, where everybody can point the finger at everybody else quite legitimately.
Yeah, and although all these people that live on the river are kind of intimately connected in one way because they're all sharing the same water, they are, like I said, as far apart as London and Athens as well. They also have kind of looking at things. Someone in America said to me, who are downstream of Canada, the Canadians shit in our water, and so we're going to catch their fish. And yeah, and so people at the Yukon's mouth who see, numbers have crashed dramatically. It was 300,000 Chinook swimming up the Yukon a few years ago. It's now down to about 30,000. So numbers have crashed tenfold. But the people at the mouth of the Yukon still see 30,000 salmon king salmon entering the Yukon. That still looks like a lot of fish. Trying to communicate to them, well, that, you know, these need to be conserved for someone 2,000 miles upriver, is a really hard, the forming those, and there are projects now to try and take people from the headwaters and take them down to the mouth, and then vice versa, and make those connections. Yeah, but yeah, it's a real, the salmon in particular. I mean, I know that all fish have their own particularities of conservation, but the salmon, by virtue of this insane life cycle that it has, is particularly hard to know where the key is to turn to fix the problem.
I thought there was another sort of sting in the tail, really, and a lot of people watching tonight will immediately recognise this, is the I think it's unfortunate for the salmon, both Atlantic and Pacific, that you get good runs and bad runs, and bad runs come and people can blame whatever for the cause of that bad run, and then the good run comes and all our problems are forgotten, even though the good run is nowhere near as good as the good runs used to be. It's another peculiar part of the salmon, whether Atlantic or Pacific, that seems to work against its survival.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, exactly. I mean, it's sort of the same as climate change, isn't it? You know, nature does have these natural oscillations, and it's easy to point to those and say that's the crux of the problem, without sort of stepping back and seeing these. You know, yes, we've had a cold year this year, but we've had 9 of the 10 hottest. You know, whatever it is, these natural oscillations can kind of muddy the waters, and that's a particularly difficult thing now. Trying to manage the salmon stocks is. So the year that I was there, it was almost a complete moratorium on catching them, and that had happened the 2 previous years as well. And so numbers do start to rebound a little bit. But people that I was talking to are saying, really, we need kind of 50 or 100 years of a moratorium case if we're going to actually start to get numbers back up sustainably, and start to increase the genetic stock, and start to allow bigger fish through, and start to get the fish back up again. And it's very hard to make that case when, you know, that people are just meant to sit back, and because that's another point that we haven't really come onto yet, is, you know, there's not much of it. There is an alternative. We have local stores now where you can buy the worst, you know, hydrogenated fat, just the worst American food for insane prices. But essentially, salmon is an integral part of the diet and the culture, and people getting their 40 salmon and putting them aside and smoking them and canning them, that is really how people live. And it's also such an important part of the culture, and bringing people together, and families going out to fish camp together and passing on the culture and doing all these things. And so it's not just an issue of wild fish conservation, it's also an issue of conserving culture. And why would you even live in these incredibly remote villages if you're not allowed to catch the fish? Then you might as well go off to the city, you know, and that is what's starting to happen. And so the question is really, yes, how do you preserve a fish, but how do you also preserve a culture?
I found there's horrible parallels to be made of the fortunes of the Chinook salmon, and of course the fortunes of First Nations people as you travel down. And you know, when you're getting on to sort of children essentially being taken and abducted, whether they liked it or not, by missionaries and stuff like that. And you know, our inhumanity to our fellow man. No wonder that the Chinook and every other species suffers when we can't even look after ourselves, it seems. I mean, I thought that was the brilliant parallel of the journey, is that it's not just the fish that are suffering or the environment that's suffering, it's what we do to each other.
Yeah, and that didn't feel, I guess writing it didn't feel like a kind of poetic analogy to sort of make it, to draw those parallels. It felt really evident that there are many different things unraveling here. You know, that you talk about the gold rush, and yes, that was one of the things that precipitated the fish's decline, but that was also the beginning of, you know, first these diseases turning up and infecting native populations, then the missionaries turning up, then as you referred to, the boarding schools where a lot of children were forcibly taken away from their parents for several years in order to civilize them, quote unquote, force their language out of them, force their dress out of them. And now the same sort of thing is happening again. Now it's kind of this sort of capitalist culture. And you know, and that's not to say that these people want to remain in some kind of romantic past. You know, these people are very much 21st century Canadians and Americans as well. You know, that they sit there and they watch Netflix and they watch the game, and you know, and they want their kids to go to university and all the rest of it. But they also want to have the dignity, I suppose, to develop in their own ways and to preserve their culture as well, because you know, and these villages are beset by problems. You know, alcoholism is rife, suicide is almost a pandemic, an epidemic, domestic violence. You know, and a lot of people will talk about the root of that being this kind of dislocation from the culture. These are children who grew up with alcoholic parents whose parents turned to drink because their kids were stolen from them and taken to boarding school for 5 years and then sent back. You know, there's a whole legacy of this kind of unraveling, and the culture is so integral to holding that together, because otherwise people just drift away to the cities and lose everything, really. So the salmon really did seem to become this, you know, it's trite to say to bring the salmon back and all the problems are fixed. Of course it's not that, but it's a really key part of the culture, yeah.
And to bring the warmth, the obvious warmth that you experienced out here, despite the problems, despite the pressures, enormous pressures, and you can see it in First Nation people all in other countries around the world, other continents around the world. You got warm receptions. You said originally when you were landing on plane, frosty receptions. I was quite taken aback by that. But it's very striking in the book. I mean, you know, adventurer, and nutter is probably another word they might have. But it was very, very. Well, tell us a little bit about the experiences you had of meeting people on the riverbank.
Yeah, we were so well looked after. You know, I think those frosty receptions from the planes came from, you know, that has been, as I've just talked about, sort of a lot of distrust of white people in the past, because generally a white person turning up in a village is either a cop or a journalist or, you know, some sort of government official. But coming into the village with a reason, and that was the beautiful thing about traveling by canoe. I'd meet someone in one village and they'd say, well, you know, make sure that you go and meet my cousin in the next village, and then you'd come into the next village and the cousin would want to know how, you know, Don was doing up the river, and so we'd sort of carry the grapevine in a way. So we sort of brought something to it, and you know, researching salmon is a wonderful way to get to eat a lot of salmon. People were fishing that year, and as soon as you turned up and you told people that you were interested in salmon, people would take you into their smokehouses, and we had salmon barbecued and smoked and sushied, and just the most amazing fish. When I really started to see that what we're getting in the supermarkets is not salmon, you know, this is salmon that's just dripping in oil. I'd hear stories about people's smokehouses that would spontaneously combust because there was so much oil around that it's just, yeah, just the most beautiful food. And people would invite us to stay the night and sharing food is a really important part of the culture as well. So yeah, there was an amazing hospitality the whole way down.
Did they try? Doesn't come across strongly in the book that they tell their stories, but were you getting sort of taps on the shoulder? You know, tell the people this. Was there a message they wanted to get out?
No, I don't think I really got that impression. I don't know if there's. Everyone was very aware that I was writing, and that was important to me to be kind of upfront about why I was there and what I was doing. I think in certain ways, people are very keen to show. Yeah, people are very keen to show that kind of respect for nature and that kind of quite harmonious way of living in the landscape, and yeah, I think almost kind of by doing. But you know, in many ways, our world feels quite far away as well. although having said that, you know, like I'm speaking a lot about the indigenous people that I'm meeting, but there's also these occasional people that we would come across. There's this sort of occasional white misanthrope, essentially, that sort of maybe moved to Alaska in the 70s. Quite a lot of people ended up there because they were dodging the draft from Vietnam.
Reality
And
TV stars as
who
well.
now oftentimes, because commercial fishing is no longer a viable way to make a living, have turned to reality TV as their way of making a living. And I'm sure a lot of people will have seen one of these shows, Life Below. There's hundreds, Life Below Zero and Deadliest Catch and Gold Rush. And we stayed with 4 different people that make their living from reality TV shows on the way down the Yukon. And for these, you know, generally quite misanthropic individuals who would then invite a film crew into their house for 4 months of the year to shadow their every move. So that's how you make a living in 21st century Alaska.
There's I put a little facetious note to myself. It is the answer in the trees. You started, I think it was in your in the addendum piece about deforestation and parallels that people can make between deforestation, and that leads to destruction of habitat because there's no longer great trunks going into, lack of food going in for other species, etc. I mean, I suppose. Yes. Is there an environment? Could you foresee is there a quick fix where lots of trees are being planted? If we saw more, is that going to be our way back? Is that going to be the way back for salmon?
I mean, Alaska has no shortage of trees, definitely. And that's one. I mean, you talk about abundance. It's, you know, we would paddle for days, weeks. Is kind of unbroken forest the whole way through, and that's not why the salmon are suffering there. But there is this incredible relationship between the salmon and the trees, which I was really unaware of until I started this journey, where the salmon, you know, will be taken by the bears and will slowly pass down the food chain. But as their bodies decay into the forest, those elements which they brought up from the ocean will break down into the soil. So these trees are getting about 75% of their nitrogen from the bottom of the ocean via the salmon, and phosphorus and carbon. There's a guy called Thomas Reimken that first discovered it, and my science isn't that great, but I think I think it's what a certain way of tracing the nitrogen that comes from the ocean means that you're able to look in tree rings and be able to see what years were particularly good salmon runs and not. And I've actually just finished reading a book by Susan Simard, who was one of the people that originally came up with this idea of the wood wide web, that all these trees are connected underground by the mushrooms. So research is now suggesting that these nutrients are not just getting taken up by the trees, but they're getting taken in by the myceliae and getting pushed further and deeper into the forest by the mushrooms to feed trees that are way back from the banks. So it's just this incredible network. And then the trees provide shade for the salmon, they provide insects for the salmon to eat. So would that happen here? I've just done a canoe trip down the River Dee, and there's a big reforestation, the Dee in Scotland, the one that comes out at Aberdeen. And there's a big reforestation project along there. And the guy called Edwin Third, who's one of the people leading it, has that theory that for various reasons we need trees in order to try and get. He thinks that the Dee and rivers like it would have once seen salmon runs, perhaps not equivalent to Alaska's runs, but huge in the past. And what don't we have any of in Scotland anymore? It's trees. You know, salmon need log jams to create the pools that they spawn, and the rivers are getting hotter and hotter to the point where in a few years' time, the fry might literally boil alive without the shade that these trees are going to provide. And perhaps there is some kind of connection with the salmon feeding the trees as well. It wouldn't be quite so apparent in Scotland because you don't have these big carnivores like the bears that are pulling the Atlantics out, and obviously some of the Atlantics go back to the ocean where they don't in the Pacific. But to me, it was one of the most interesting kind of joined up ways of thinking about what can we do about the salmon was, you know, there's an increasing understanding, I think, whether you call it rewilding or ecosystem restoration or whatever you call it, that we can't think about these things in isolation. And the salmon and the trees are really, really bound up with each other in incredible ways.
The journey itself, you do a pretty good job of convincing the reader that you weren't particularly scared, or not certainly for any particular length of time. You mentioned bears. You had, I think, just was it a grizzly in the end? I can't remember. I remember I've not forgotten the description. A grizzly has a snout like a collie. I'm going to keep that. It could come
in case you ever need it.
Well, I remember you saying you became you were seeing things better after a time on the river, and also almost becoming quite sort of suspicious. Not what's the word, suspicious, into talismans and stuff like that. You were getting sort of quite. But what about the actual journey itself? The moments of fear and terror, or you seem to take it, as I said, in your stride.
There were definitely occasional moments of it. For the most part, it was very pleasant. It's it's light for about 23 hours of the day. They have these short but very beautiful summers in the north. Being out in the river, we were quite far from the mosquitoes, and I'm used to kind of long hiking trips with sort of an incredibly heavy backpack. But in a canoe, you can take as much as you want. So we had, we would make bread in the evenings. We had chairs, we had a spice rack, and you can just drift. We'd paddle most of the time, but occasionally we'd drift and make a coffee and read to each other, and it's a very lovely way to travel. But yeah, there were definitely moments of peril. I'm aware that my mum and dad are on this call as well.
When you're talking about a river delta being 3 miles wide and you're in a boat that's 18 feet long, that in itself, I can, even if it's not rushing on, that's quite a thought to carry with me. But what else?
Yeah, I mean, it feels like, and also we would try on the good days to be right out in the middle of the river, because that's where the current is fastest. And you'd have these sort of sudden moments of vertigo pulling back and realizing that, yeah, you're in an 18-foot boat in a 3 mile wide river. And to get to the shore would be a long way, would be a sort of hour paddle probably to get to the shore. And the weather can change very quickly, and that really was the main thing in the end. The bears is the thing that you keep in the back of your mind, because they're the really easy thing to be scared about. But in the end, it was the river. It was the just the hugeness of the river, and the capsizing would have been it would have been a terrible thing. The water's very cold. It's very silty, so it can really just fill up your pockets and your boots very quickly. And there's no real way you're going to right a fully packed 18-foot canoe in the middle of a river. So capsizing would have been a profoundly stupid thing to do. We only really had rapids in the first week, and after that it is quite a simple river, really. I'm absolutely not a kind of technical canoeist or anything like that. It was sort of the same things as you bear in mind in any kind of camping trip, really. It was about being sensible, basically. We spent a lot of time not paddling when the weather got up, and just sitting in the tent for days on end reading and waiting for the weather to change.
Yeah, that heavy storm sounded really quite harsh, I have to say. Just sat I had it in Sweden, and yeah, it's hard to forget. I said we'd return to the supermarket, and at the end of your journey, you bring us back to Tesco on the Seven Sisters Road, and it's a horrible way of sort of tying off all the loose ends, because here we have the very same fish that you'd met the people fishing for at the start of your journey, and I've got to note down £3.50 for 220 grams is not a lot of money for a fish that's come halfway around the world and has gone through so many people's hands, commercially, from the people catching it, processing it, shipping it, etc. And it's kind of within that alone, I just thought, oh God, I mean, that's the problem, isn't it? It's just too cheap.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to say there. So there's one small commercial fishery right at the mouth of the Yukon River, and it's one of the very few fair trade designated fisheries in the world because all the profit goes back into the local people. They're not catching king, they're catching uh, silver, and they're catching, maybe it was only silver. I think it might have been only silver, which gets marketed as keta. So in chum as well, which gets marketed as keta here. And that to me seemed a very well managed fishery, and yeah, it feels cheap here, but it felt to me that I know this fish's story. I went to see where it was getting packaged down in southwest London, and then it's getting sent out to all the different supermarkets as wild Alaskan salmon. But and it felt incredible in one way to be standing in Tesco and actually being really aware of what this fish's journey would have been or could have been. Also quite overwhelming to then look around and see the 10,000 other products in the supermarket, and how am I ever possibly going to know what I'm buying? I've spent 3 years researching this single product. How am I meant to get a handle on, and then, but also to look across and see farmed salmon at an equivalent price and marketed in a very similar way, and to know there was this completely other story there that comes from the farmed fish.
Did you, having completed your journey, and I think hopefully everybody watching today will have got that it is a mind-boggling series of disparate problems that the Chinook salmon face. What could you impart? I know that here we're all thinking about Atlantic salmon, so I'm just interested. There are so many parallels between the problems of Atlantic salmon and Pacific salmon. The idea of hatcheries to support dwindling stocks. Luckily over there, the hatcheries are all inland. Oh, they'll never escape. They'll never escape. Along comes a storm and a flood, and they escape. I mean, there's kind of stories that we've been hearing in the UK for, unfortunately, for decades now. Have you? If we accept, and I'm totally swept along by it, that it's just a huge range of disparate problems, that sort of a holistic approach is needed. Give us some clear lines of action that we might be able to take on board to do something positive
for fish in the UK.
For the preservation of salmon
in the UK.
In the UK.
I would say salmon farming is a huge part of the problem here. That's not the case in Alaska. Alaska banned salmon farming in the 90s, and that's really starting to catch on in a lot of the rest of the Pacific Northwest now. It's happened in Washington State, Canada, as some tribes in Canada are starting to kick fish farms off of their land. And I live on Loch Fyne. I look across at a fish farm every day, and fish farms seem to be having such detrimental effects on wild populations that I really don't think that the two can coexist hand in hand. So on some level, that's the kind of consumer choice there's definitely a choice that I make now to never buy farmed salmon. I don't think it's definitely not all about consumer choice, but that's one place to start. I think there are ways that salmon farming can be done responsibly. They can be done in closed tanks. They can be fed insect proteins. They can be powered with renewables. There could be ways to do it, but we're going to have to accept that we're going to have to spending a lot more on our salmon, and it's probably not going to be the value fish that you get in cheap sushi anymore. And then I think reforesting is another really interesting angle, and supporting projects like the one that's happening on the D. These kind of full ecosystem restoration projects that are trying to restore our rivers, rivers that have been so kind of channeled in order to never flood and to stay in the kind of straight line, and that's exactly not what salmon needs. Salmon want rivers to be opening out over their floodplains, and the trees to be creating log jams and creating pools, and the ways that we think about that our rivers have to flow in a certain place in order to kind of preserve, because this is the land and this is the fishing rights and this is the estate, and starting to think about ways that rivers can be rivers feels really important to me as well.
I think that there are some parallels, I guess, between traditional netting operations, perhaps, in this country and First Nation activities. Some people think this is provocative. It's not meant to be. Do you think banning? You wrote so beautifully about the netting. It's so romantic. I got swept along, and from thinking, oh, what an easy way of getting our dwindling stocks out onto land. You write about them, and I thought, oh, isn't it awful? These wonderful, these traditional, wonderful people who clearly love everything about the fish and everything. It's not their fault the numbers have gone down, and yet they're not allowed to fish. No one's really allowed to salmon fish or take salmon anymore. That's just the way it has to be.
Well, I think, at least along the Yukon, it's definitely not as black and white as sort of commercial fishermen bad and indigenous fishermen good. Indigenous fishermen, each family will take maybe 100 fish, which is not very much, but you go down the length of the Yukon and that really adds up. And yeah, these very traditional fishing techniques have now been replaced by people in small aluminium speedboats, and they have monofilament nets, and things have become much more effective, even in kind of what we'd call a small scale artisanal fishery. It does still make an impact. I really think I'm not nearly as aware of how it as a traditional netsman in the story of it here, so I couldn't really speak to here. But I think I don't think anyone is blameless in this. I think certain people maybe have more cards in the game because there's a sense of kind of preserving culture, and I think certain cultures should be given, culture should perhaps be prioritized over economic profit in how people get to use these resources. But I don't think anyone is, squeaky clean.
No, I don't think they are.
It was interesting, just to make one other point, it was interesting to see, because the First Nations people in Canada and Alaska have very different management structures. They have a lot more autonomy in Canada. And so unless there's an emergency, in which point the Canadian government's allowed to step in, Canadian villages will set their own fishing quotas. And contrary to what we assume when people are allowed to do what they want, the Canadians were making very sensible choices. The first village that I went to in Canada hadn't fished for 20 years because they could see what was happening to the stocks, and voluntarily they decided not to fish. Whereas when I went onto the Alaskan side, where everything is controlled by the state and the federal government, people are just doing whatever they can get away with and trying to get a bit more done. So I think that to me was quite a good argument for putting people in charge of their own resources, and that it can work.
Did you and it must be difficult to answer this without your other experiences, other adventures coming into play some degree. But did you finish the journey with any sort of sense of hope for the future of Chinook salmon?
Yeah, I did actually. I did. And being an environmental journalist, I'm quite used to writing stories that feel quite hopeless. And this was not that. There was a sense that there's a huge decline here, but it's been caught in time. And there are a lot of people that are really interested in trying to fix this. Most people are interested in trying to fix this. The problems are vast, and what needs to be done is very complex. But the sorts of initiatives of trying to listen to Indigenous voices, trying to get different ends of the river meeting up together, trying to get Indigenous and government and biologists all sitting on the same panels, all of that felt positive to me. It doesn't feel like a lost cause. Of course, climate change is the elephant in the room, and that is kind of beyond the control of how the Yukon gets managed. But I think that aside, I think there are ways to turn this around, and salmon have come back in other places. There's been these iconic sort of dam removals on rivers like the Elwha in the United States, and now the Klamath, where they're pushing to remove the dams, which would be the biggest dam removal project ever. And you take dams away, you create the right conditions. You know, salmon have come back to Sheffield city centre. Salmon have been seen in Paris again. You clean up water, you do the right things. Nature does have an amazing capacity to heal itself, and I think there is still time for this, Chinook. Yeah,
that's a fabulously positive note to well, to end on. I just want to add, if it hasn't come through already, how much I enjoyed the book, and I hope it hasn't come across that it's sort of facts and arguments all the way through, because it really isn't that at all. It's a really quite lyrical journey down a river in which people tell their stories, and through those stories, you, the reader, become wiser and more aware of the plight of the Chinook salmon as it goes. I thought it's an absolute fabulous read, and I can't wait for your next one, Adam, to be quite honest. What was it you said just before we came on? Coronavirus hasn't been great for travel journalism. I wish you all the best with the next one, and I really, really congratulate Kings of the Uke for a fabulous read.
Thank you very much.
And that's it. That's our last Untangled talk for the season, at least. Hopefully, we should be returning in September, around September, maybe October. And I know Nick in particular is very keen, as a lot of you are, to talk about beavers. So I'm sure we'll have a sort of feisty, maybe panel set up for that to come. But for now, I will wish you, those of you that are fishing at least, tight lines through the season. And to Adam, best of luck and safe travels as well. Pleasure meeting you.
Thanks, Matthew.
Take care.